The Vimy Memorial in France is a soaring monument to Canada's most celebrated military victory, the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Its panels are inscribed with the names of thousands of men who are still missing after the battle. But what if some of them could be found? Historian Norm Christie believes he can solve the mystery of 44 Canadian soldiers killed at Vimy Ridge, whose bodies were lost after the war, and that the truth lies in a muddy field just 4 kilometers away.
They knew where his body was after he was killed.
Forbes wasn't missing. He was buried somewhere.
They said that he had died, but then they didn't have a body.
Norm has grassroots support from across the country, but he has little time and limited money to search an area littered with explosives.
Oh, wow. Is that still dangerous?
Yes, wait.
With a team of scientists, bomb disposal experts, and the families of the missing men, Norm is leading a mission to find Vimy's lost soldiers.
We have to treat them as the heroes that they are. It's our obligation to recover these bodies.
April 1917. Fighting on the Western Front has come to a stalemate as the Germans hold a strategic high ground known as Vimy Ridge. For more than 2 years, Britain and France have tried and failed to capture the ridge. Now it's Canada's turn. For the first time in the war, all 4 Canadian divisions will fight as a single unified force. On the morning of April 9th, following the largest artillery barrage in history, Canadian troops charge into no man's land with a bravery and ferocity that stun the enemy and the world. After 4 days of bitter fighting, Canada takes the ridge. With victory at Vimy, Canada emerges from the shadow of Great Britain to proclaim its nationhood, but at a horrifying cost.
Vimy Ridge was the strongest German position on the Western Front. So the attack that was going to take place on it was going to take terrible casualties. And although it was a great victory, it took the lives of 3,500 Canadian men. So for many families all across Canada, it wasn't a victory, it was a tragedy.
The dead are buried in a series of military cemeteries spread out around the old battlefield and administered by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Norm Christie is an expert on war cemeteries. The author of over 20 books, Norm has spent 35 years researching Vimy's battlefield and burial grounds. For several of those years, he acted as Chief Records Officer for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. There, Norm personally identified the graves of 75 missing soldiers. Norm knows how to unravel the mysteries of these graveyards, but he'll discover his most challenging yet in Leven Cemetery.
This is Leven Communal Cemetery Extension. It was made after the war from small cemeteries and isolated graves found in the 1920s. I was working on my book, Sacred Places, and I was doing a little section on Leven, and I found an old document that I had kept for 25 years. These 4 men, 4 Canadians, were brought in, unidentified. And I could tell by the map reference they're from the Vimy battlefield. But they were brought in with a broken grave registration unit cross, bearing the following inscription: in memory of the undermentioned soldiers who fell in action 9/4/17 and are buried at this spot. And then it was broken, and there was only one name you could get off it, which was R. Owen.
As the bodies from makeshift graves were gathered into formal cemeteries, it was common practice to bring along any burial markers. What caught Norm's eye was that if this marker belonged to these 4 graves, why were they unidentified? If one was R. Owen, it should be a simple matter to search the records and find the names of his gravemates.
So I thought if I go to the original burial documents, I'll be able to find the other names, and I'll be able to put names to those 4 graves. So to do that, R. Owen had to be researched. He was with the 16th Battalion Canadian Scottish, and he was killed April 9th, 1917. So I went through all their original place of burial cards, which are online, and I'm looking for ones that are going to be buried with R. Owen.
Norm quickly discovered R. Owen was not listed as buried in Leven Cemetery. He was listed as missing grave unknown. But Owen was originally recorded as having once been buried in a registered battlefield grave. Norm began compiling a list of every man from the 16th Canadian Scottish killed the same morning as Owen.
And I managed to check all the men on it, and I ended up finding R. Owen being buried not with 3 other men, but with 43 other men.
One name on a broken grave marker led Norm to an incredible discovery. Evidence of a mass grave containing 44 missing Canadian soldiers. It was called CA-40. C for Canadian, A for 1st Division, grave number 40. One of the missing men on the CA-40 cross was Thomas Alban Snellgrove. Thomas Snellgrove left England to join his older brother in cowboy country in the Canadian West. They had only been farming near Eiley, Alberta for a few years when Thomas volunteered to go back and fight for England. He was 21.
I'm Robert Snellgrove Jr., and I am Thomas Alban Snellgrove's great-nephew. And this is my grandson, Thomas Alban Snellgrove's great-great-great-nephew.
Luke.
What we know about our uncle is that when you look through the list of the last people that joined up in Vermilion, they're all Englishmen. That's who was here then. That was for King and Country. That was what you did.
I am Melissa Snellgrove Genthner. Thomas Alban is my great-great-great uncle. 3 years ago, he was just a great-great-uncle, I'd never heard of. My dad literally has talked to every second, third, fourth, fifth cousin, trying to find pictures, medals, documentation, any stories.
We didn't think there was anything left of his at all. Left everything he owned with his brother in a trunk. That was all destroyed in a fire. And then I talked or met with one of my cousins, and they had this protractor set, which was given to my uncle in 1906 for perfect attendance at the middle school. Basically 10 years after he got it, he was killed. But that's somebody's life.
The cross also held the name of missing soldier Ernest Earl Betts. 26-year-old Earl and his brother Clarence were homesteading in southern Alberta when he enlisted.
I was shocked to learn that Uncle Earl was kind of lost. I just assumed that he was buried somewhere that they would be recognized or there would be a cross. I had no idea that we didn't know where his whereabouts were. When I grew up, there wasn't a lot of conversation about Uncle Earl and Grandpa, so it's been an interesting sort of progression of learning about them. Do you want to take a little walk out here?
Yeah. This is Uncle Earl's, and this is Dad's. And the soddy was up just about a half mile up there. It would have been darn tough. There was no water. There was just a bunch of prairie. They had a soddy shack. That was what they lived in, a house made out of sod, just dirt. Dad and Earl were apparently very close in their life. Uncle Earl went to Lethbridge, I guess, and come back and told Dad he was in the Army, so Dad packed up and went too.
When did you find out that Uncle Earl was missing, that they actually didn't have a marked grave for him?
Last November. Yeah, that's when they said they figure there's 44 men in that hole. A lot of hurt there.
In the years following the war, exhumation companies were hired to take on the enormous task of consolidating thousands of scattered burial sites, such as CA-40, into larger, permanent cemeteries. Records were carefully kept, so wherever possible, soldiers would have an identifiable grave. According to the records, the bodies from CA-40 were moved to 9 Elms Military Cemetery, a mere 300 yards from where they had first been buried.
This is 9 Elms Military Cemetery, and this is the cemetery register. It states that one of the cemeteries brought in here was grave CA-40 Tilou. Here were buried 44 Canadian soldiers of the 16th Battalion who fell on the 9th of April, 1917. It indicates the men of CA-40 should be buried here. But I've checked every grave, and they're not here. The making of the war cemeteries that took place after the First World War had a very specific protocol. You had an officer in charge of the labor or exhumation companies clearing the battlefield of graves. They would then bring them to a war cemetery, and there would be an officer in charge there. And he would take care of all those burials and the registration of those graves. Somehow, one of those men made an error, and that's why they say CA-40 is here when it is not. The issue is, did both of them make an error? Did they only get a few graves from the area of CA-40 and then they check it off the list and forget the other 40? We don't know. All we know for sure is they're not here.
Assuming there was an error, was it possible the 44 men were moved to the wrong cemetery? To find out, Norm searched each of the 12 cemeteries containing Vimy unknowns and checked over 20,000 graves holding unidentified soldiers. His last stop was Cabaret Rouge.
This cemetery is one of the largest in France. It contains 7,500 graves. About 60% are unidentified. The ones we're looking at are the unidentified ones. So we're looking for a row of maybe 40 Canadian Highlanders, unidentified, that will come from the same location as CA-40. However, I've checked the documents, and I've actually made a ground check. I walked through this entire cemetery, checking out the graves. And it's clear there's no men here from CA-40. So the next question is, where are they?
In a bid to recover and properly bury the missing men, Norm's next step was to inform the Canadian government of his search.
The Canadian government is more than aware of this project. They claim that they could not be proactive. They did not want to get involved. And this includes DND, of course, we've heard nothing from Veterans Affairs, Heritage, all these other things. They actually declined to get involved. It's received national press. It did TV, radio, newspapers continuously. We've had a fundraiser going. So really, we're on our own here. This is our unofficial campaign to recover the men of Vimy Ridge.
Norm's unofficial campaign caught the attention of the families of the missing men, who began contacting Norm with stories and support. One of the families was that of Arthur Forbes Ruddock, a 19-year-old from Vancouver. His great-nephew, Scott Perry, now lives in Ottawa.
When I heard Norm Christie first talk about CA-40, my reaction was, wow. Forbes Ruddock was my great-uncle, my grandmother being Forbes's sister. He was buried in CA-40, but listed as missing after the war. I think about it in the context of my grandmother. If she was alive today, she'd be enthralled because they were clearly so close. And as I've learned more about him, I have drawn more of a connection to him. There's a physical similarity. I have a handkerchief that was taken off Forbes's body. The note that is attached, it says, this handkerchief was found in Forbes's pocket. And this is an amazing thing because they knew where his body was after he was killed. And I've always known Forbes to be missing, but he clearly wasn't missing at one point in time. It was the first clue for me that Forbes wasn't missing. He was buried somewhere. Otherwise, how did they get this hanky?
After the war, some grieving families traveled all the way to France to search for lost loved ones. Inquiries after the men of CA-40 led to a change in their designation from buried to missing. It was a blow to those already struggling for closure. One such family was that of Lancelot Morris Atwood.
I believe my grandmother was devastated when her husband was killed. She didn't believe it because at first they said that he had died, but then they didn't have a body. So this is my grandfather and my mother. This was a special picture to my mother. It's probably the one and only that we have of the two of them together. My grandma didn't talk much about her life, her early life at all. She was deaf. She became deaf about the time my mother was born. So grandma never heard my mother's voice. My grandma was unable to travel because of her hearing loss. Just didn't make it possible. So she sent her brother, my Uncle Sid, over to check to see if indeed they could find a body. And at that point, they couldn't find one. After Grandpa was killed, she just became a strong woman and carried on. She raised my mother. She must have found strength. And possibly at that point, she still felt her husband would come home. She was still hoping.
As Norm tries to figure out what might have happened to Maury Atwood and the other missing men, his search takes him to an isolated cemetery that may hold a clue to the fate of CA-40.
This very pretty battlefield cemetery is called 9th Avenue, and it was named after a trench that ran by here. It's a battlefield cemetery. It's a mass grave. It was over 40 men.
Whenever mass graves held 40 bodies or more, the War Graves Commission ordered the exhumation companies not to move them.
The mass graves are really one body on top of each other. There's still flesh on the bones. They're still decaying. It was a gruesome and horrible task for the exhumation companies to find these men. Consequently, if you had a mass burial, it would be a problem to exhume them, a problem to try to identify them. So in many cases, they chose a unique layout so that the graves could be commemorated without being moved. Now, CA-40 is almost identical to this. It's a battlefield cemetery. It's a mass grave. It was over 40 men. So there's a lot of parallels between CA-40 and what we see here. However, we know CA-40 vanished in the 1920s.
If graves of 40 or more were not supposed to be moved, and given that separating this many remains would be difficult, Norm is faced with a question. Why would they move CA-40 at all? Norm has walked through miles of headstones and sifted through hundreds of records. Now his search for the lost men of CA-40 brings him back to the windswept potato field where they were last seen.
On April 9th, 1917, the Canadian Corps burial officer created a cemetery right here, and he buried 44 men of the Canadian Scottish who were killed earlier that morning. I've evaluated all the documents associated with the cemetery as to whether or not they were moved or where they were moved to, and I can find no evidence that they were moved at all. That means that CA-40 is still here. Now we have to prove that the men are here, and there's only one way to do that, and that's by digging.
Norm is certain CA-40 is in this field, but finding its exact location after 100 years will not be easy. Thanks to grassroots fundraising and donations of time and equipment, military historian Norm Christie has managed to assemble a team of experts to help in his search for 44 lost soldiers of Vimy.
My name's Chris Phillips. I'm a geophysicist with Golder Associates. We volunteered our time and equipment to try and help Norm in his investigation for the CA-40 mass grave. Geophysics is looking underground without digging. What we're trying to do here is better pinpoint where the mass grave might be such that we can focus our investigation in those areas.
Before Chris and his geophysics crew can survey the site of CA-40, it has to be cleared of unexploded shells lying below the surface.
This was a bitterly contested battlefield in 1914, 15, 16, and 17. So millions of shells were fired off in this area, and some of them are still in the ground and they're still live. So before we can go anywhere, we have to call on the bomb experts, Sécurité Civile. The shells you're going to find here are primarily high explosive and shrapnel. Now, the high explosive shells are the most dangerous because they're full of TNT. They will blow. And if anyone gets hit by them, they're dead.
Oh, wow.
Oui, c'est un explosif.
Is that still dangerous then?
Est-ce que c'est encore dangereux? Est-ce qu'elle est dangereuse? Yes. Oui. He has to move it to on a short distance and a lot of precaution. When they discover something like that, we should clear the area. Nobody should be around.
Okay.
Because it can still be explosive.
So should we leave?
Okay, so we should back
should
up
we leave?
then. All right. Okay.
Yeah, we should leave.
All right.
One of the missing men on the CA-40 cross, Robert Edward Bradshaw, spent 2 years with the Canadian artillery before he transferred to the front line for the assault on Vimy Ridge. He left 3 sons under the age of 3 in St. John, New Brunswick. Peter Bradshaw lives in the suburbs of Toronto. His grandfather was the youngest of those little boys.
My great-grandfather, he was in a dugout with a few of his fighting buddies, and a mortar went off and blew everybody up. Family story goes that he was found with a live puppy in his pocket after he was killed, along with a poem that he had written. Maybe the puppy had strayed into the trench, or if he had it for a few days, I'm not sure. The poem inspired me to try and illustrate a little bit from the poem. The battlefront was shell-torn. There is a small puppy on this chap's lap here that he's sort of hunched over. I guess that could be taken as my great-grandfather. We've always discussed as a family the possibility of going to France and visiting the Vimy Memorial, because I know it meant a lot to my father. And my grandfather, sorry.
Inspired by Norm's campaign, several families of the lost soldiers head to France to join him in his search.
I'm waiting for the families to arrive from the airport, and this is actually very exciting. It's been a long time in coming, and they can only come because of our grassroots fundraiser in Canada. And that means a lot of caring Canadians, including a number of the family members, have contributed to this project.
I have never been to France before. I've actually never left North America. It's going to be exciting for me, actually.
I think I'm doing it for the entire family. To honor our Uncle Earl, it's definitely a privilege to be able to go. It's a privilege to be able to take my daughter with me.
Not knowing much about my grandfather, this is, for my whole family, it's going to be tremendous.
Going to Vimy Ridge, to me, it's the only way that you'll ever grasp the magnitude of the sacrifice that they made. I don't think you can really feel that till you go there.
This is it, Walter Allward's masterpiece. Canada's National War Memorial on Vimy Ridge. The 11,300 Canadians missing in France are commemorated on the bastion of the memorial. Your relatives are all named on this memorial. Your family story is particularly hard. It's a very, very sad story. He went off to war. He left his wife with a young baby, and he never returned.
There's stories of Mom, yearning for her father to come home from the war, and he never did.
It's always felt to me like there was that missing end to the story, and to finally see his name there, it's amazing.
We really didn't know very much about him. I probably didn't listen to my grandmother's stories as much as I should have when I was growing up, and I regret that now.
Your great uncle was one of the heroes of Vimy. Does that give you a sense of pride?
Yeah, there's more of an emotional attachment there now to him because he's become a person before he was a name. Part of it is the emotional attachment to my grandmother, his younger sister. If she knew that his body was not missing, I can only imagine what her reaction would be to that.
And it's right here.
Oh, there he is.
Clarence and Earl fought together. Clarence lost his brother and probably his best friend. This must have had like a devastating effect on him in some way.
Grandpa never spoke of it. He wouldn't speak of the war. Dad said there was very little he would ever say about the war. I think he was so traumatized by it.
Thomas Snellgrove, tell me about him.
Thomas was a great uncle. He enlisted in Eiley, Alberta, a tiny little town, in 1916, and came over here and earned his place in the wall.
How do you feel about that?
I guess it's a... You can't say it's an honor, because
well, you're heroes.
Yeah, I think pride and honor are the best way to describe it. We can all think of the life that they gave us, that he helped give us. Freedom, right?
Yeah, they did that.
After this much time, to even think they know where they are, it's just the right thing to at least give them a marker. That would be I guess, a very fitting bookend to the story.
If Norm wants to find the remains and give the lost soldiers a proper marker, he will have to dig on a potato field that is privately owned. The Leclerc family has been farming here since before the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and Norm will need to convince them to allow the dig on their land.
Ce qui nous intéresse, l'endroit où le cimetière disparu, c'était l'endroit d'une des plus grandes batailles de la Première Guerre. Là où est votre ferme, ni plus ni moins votre récolte présentement. C'est un des plus grands champs de bataille qui sont vraiment importants pour le Canada, là où vous êtes présentement, là où vous faites de la récolte.
Ben, on accepte de donner la permission de creuser, quoi. Il n'y a pas de problème.
Merci beaucoup. De la part de notre groupe de travail, de la part aussi des familles qui attendent de voir si on va trouver leurs ancêtres dans le cimetière disparu. Merci.
With permission to dig, this is the biggest thing. With all the other work we've done, we now bring it all together, and we're going to try to find these guys. Okay, guys, follow me up the Vimy Ridge. There's a bunch of small roads, so keep as close to me as you can so we won't get lost.
Okay, great.
The Vimy battlefield is unique. It has the greatest number of mine craters on the Western Front. It is also the only place where burial officers used mine craters to create mass graves. One such grave is Vimy crater, just a few hundred meters from where Norm believes CA-40 will be found. It offers the geophysicists a typical profile and supports Norm's leading theory that the missing soldiers of CA-40 were buried in a mine crater.
So this is Vimy crater, and what happened was this was blown on the battlefield from underground mining in 1916, and it was a huge crater in no man's land. And after the advance on April 9, 1917, the Canadian Corps burial officer came through here, and they took all the remains in no man's land in the first German line, and they buried roughly 50 of them in this position. So this is a mass grave built in a crater, which is going to be very similar to CA-40.
So right now what we're doing is ground penetrating radar, which is also known as GPR. What it does is it sends electromagnetic energy in pulses down into the ground, and they're bouncing off of features in the ground and coming back, and the sensor's reading that to understand and to do a profile of the ground as to what's underneath.
We have roughly 50 men buried here.
Yeah.
It's roughly the same number as the cemetery that we're looking for in the middle of the farmer's field.
Yeah.
So we're hoping to match those two profiles.
That's right.
For the families of the lost soldiers, the search is a chance to reach back through the generations and complete an unfinished story. The Bentata Cave is an ancient chalk quarry less than a kilometer from the front line, well within range of the German guns. Here, the 16th Battalion took shelter days before the battle. With artillery pounding overhead, troops carved more than 1,000 pieces of graffiti into the chalk. For many, these would be the final words they would be remembered by.
This is the Bentata Cave. It was used by the Canadians. It was behind the front line, and it was a good place for support troops to be safe and yet still be close to the front. And a lot of them carved things in the chalk. And this one will be very much of interest to you. Thomas Alvin Snellgrove. You're standing exactly where Thomas Snellgrove stood in April 1917. You're totally in his footsteps. This was going to be his first battle. So when they were here, he carved this. And he's got the 151st Cap badge.
For all the soldiers that were down here to actually find a name and find a family that belongs to that name is quite amazing.
He meant for this to be found because he gave so much detail and so much for us to go off of to figure out who it was. He made sure not to just make it vague. There's so much detail in it.
And he was clearly proud to be Canadian and Albertan. The trunk of materials he had left in had burnt down, so there was literally, this is what remains, and it stayed for 100 years, and it is something that's going to stay for a long time.
Well, it is very hard to put words to.
This is one of the results of the ground penetrating radar from the Vimy crater.
So explain this to me.
Think of it as a slice through the ground beneath the sensor. So what we're seeing here, the top line here, is the actual ground surface itself.
Okay.
And then we're seeing these reflections that come back at different depths.
The blue line is actually the shape of the crater.
Yeah, exactly. So we can actually see the outline of the crater. And what we also see are these discontinuous anomalies, these sort of reflections that are above that. That's what we believe the bodies are.
So that's the 50 men.
That's right.
So this is almost exactly what we're looking for in terms of profile.
So zooming out on the map a little bit, just up here is where Vimy crater is. So relative to the CA-40 site, it's only 500 meters away. So far, the results are all looking rather reassuring in terms of helping to First, identify where the CA-40 site might be, and then to better identify what sort of features might be in the bottom of these craters to understand whether they're potentially bodies.
Now that the team has a snapshot of a mass grave, they know what to look for in the field.
I think tomorrow's going to be an exciting day.
Yeah, I hope so too.
So, Chris, the weather's really taken a turn for the worse here.
It has, certainly. The 60-kilometer-an-hour winds and pelting rain is a lot of fun out here.
And you know that it was forecast for sun today.
I know. The rain hasn't cooperated with us because now the ground is really water-rich and stuff. It's been limiting the depth of investigation that we've been able to see.
To make matters worse, the soil in Vimy crater is different to the soil in the potato field. It is rich in clay, and ground-penetrating radar cannot see very deeply into clay. Unfortunately, the geophysics data from Vimy is less helpful than hoped for in the search for the lost soldiers of Vimy.
Our hope is to come back when conditions are much drier for the field, and we can get much more detail out here, and we can better identify the location of the CA-40 mass grave.
Despite the setbacks, Norm and his team won't give up their search for Vimy's lost soldiers. April 1917. Canada is moving thousands of troops into position for the attack on Vimy Ridge. This country road was once a light railway carrying reinforcements and supplies up to the Vimy front. It would take Betts, Bradshaw, Snellgrove, Atwood, and Ruddock past Villers Station Cemetery and the graves of the men they had come to replace.
This is a typical war graves headstone. It has the cap badge or the national emblem, and this is the maple leaf for Canada. After the war, they sent out final verification forms to all the families, and the families could indicate religious emblem, and they could also supply a personal inscription, which makes these headstones very, very unique. To me, the most powerful thing on the headstone is the personal inscription. And would you like to read this one for me?
For king and country, thus he fell, a tyrant's arrogance to quell.
This, of course, does not apply for your relatives. Because they have no known grave and are only engraved on the Vimy monument, there's no headstone. The personal inscriptions were only for those who have a known grave. What I'd like to ask you to do is to go around the cemetery and pick a personal inscription that you think is very special.
I have called thee by thy name, thou art mine. I chose it because the person was the same age as me. He's 16 when he died. So I chose it because, like, thinking about, they're my age. Like, your life's just starting and it just ended.
Ever loved and remembered and is home across the sea. Because even though he's buried so far from home, he's still remembered.
He made the supreme sacrifice, duty nobly done. Now he rests. These people completely gave themselves, right? And 23 years old. You know, just unbelievable.
He died for freedom. His name shall liveth on forevermore. Because I think it represents what brought us all here, to find our own family that died for freedom, and their name should live on forevermore too.
At 2 a.m. on April 9th, 1917, the 16th Battalion moved into position in the frontline trenches. Their objective, to drive the Germans back toward Toulouse. The lost men of CA-40 had only hours to live.
This potato field was the battlefield of the Canadian Scottish on April 9th, 1917. On the 8th of April, at 6 p.m., everyone started to move to the front, and they were set by 2 a.m. All through the night, the artillery picked up with intensity until the noise was a huge crescendo, and they're smashing the German lines all across this position. And finally, at 5:30 a.m., the whistles blow, they came out of their trenches and started the attack. Right now, we're in the middle of no man's land. The German front line was about 40 yards away, and they had all sorts of machine guns set up. And these men had been underground during the barrage, so they had survived it. They came to their trenches and opened up on them, and of course, this is where the men started to fall. They continued the attack, but the losses had been terrible. 341 had been killed or wounded. We've just crossed the no man's land, just like your relatives did on April 9th, 1917. It was a very chaotic battle. Most of them are just listed as killed in action. Snellgrove was just killed in action. Bradshaw just killed in action. Betts just killed in action. But one of the interesting ones is they have a very small piece of information on Maury Atwood. All it says is this soldier was shot through the head by an enemy rifle bullet and instantly killed during the Battle of Vimy Ridge. But you have something else, don't you, Wendy? Something with a lot more detail.
I do. It's from his trench mate. It's written to my grandfather's mother. It says, "Dear Mrs. Atwood, if I say anything in this short letter that may open up your wounds afresh, please forgive me. Well, Mrs. Atwood, your son and I were friends from the time we joined the 113th Battalion in Lethbridge, and were inseparable, whether in camp, on the march, or in battle. On the morning of the 9th of April, we started over towards the German lines behind our artillery barrage. We had just finished clearing the enemy out of their headquarters, dugout, and we're on our way to the next line of trenches when he fell back into my arms. His death was one that falls to very few soldiers. It was instantaneous. Yours very sincerely, Peter Auld."
Robert Bradshaw was also killed on this field, and they found some personal effects on him, as well as a story about a puppy. He apparently had a puppy with him.
Yeah, he had a puppy in his pocket, as well as a poem.
Can you read it?
Yeah. The front line. In front, a ragged, shell-torn waste, barbed wire, and know-some weeds. The grave of many gallant men who died for his country needs. The bar between two mighty foes, alert, watchful, and still, like savage beasts as they pause and wait, ere they spring to rend and kill.
The rattle of the machine gun spraying death along the line. The boom of a distant field gun, then a shrill increasing whine. A crash, an acrid blinding smoke. A shower of stones and dirt. Then casually someone asks, "Is anybody hurt?" And then a low-voiced call comes down for stretcher bearers here. Men hurry by, and soon a moan falls on the listening ear. Somebody hit. You merely think, and no one stops at all. But out here, one soon gets used to seeing comrades fall. Day after day, night after night, the same grim, wearing strife. Men come and go, some stay, those who for right gave up their life. For yes, we know the right is ours, our cause is just and true.
And so we care not what we hear or what we have to do.
Private Robert E. Bradshaw, 16th Canadian Scottish, killed Vimy Ridge, April 9th, 1917.
The search is ready to move on to the next phase, and the families can head home with a renewed sense of optimism.
I think it's time for them to be honored and be given their voices. If you make efforts to do the right thing, then it's never done in vain. There's always good that will come. Finding him would be sort of the icing on the cake. Looking for him and knowing that he's been searched for, that's just as important to me. They need to be rediscovered. They need to be given voices that they don't otherwise have now. You can't find unless you do search.
Better weather on Vimy Ridge means Chris Phillips and his team can continue their geophysics investigation to determine the exact location of CA40.
The techniques we're going to try using today are ground-penetrating radar. It takes a reading every centimeter as we go across the field. And so you get a sort of profile as you go along the line of what the subsurface is like and how it's changing. Whether you're seeing trenches, whether you're seeing bodies, in which case you're seeing these point anomalies that are coming off, that sort of thing.
First, they need to locate where the German trenches and mine craters were in 1917. They take a satellite map of the field today and fit it over a military map of the 1917 battlefield. By matching features still present on both maps, like the Zivy crater and main roads, this reveals the approximate positions of the German trenches and mine craters as they appear in a 1917 aerial photograph taken just days before the battle. But the area the team must search is very large, over 2,500 square yards.
Some of the challenges to the survey are the conditions of the field currently. The potatoes haven't been plowed yet, and you can see that they're quite built up. For the radar survey, the radar antennas need to be well coupled to the ground, and that's certainly proving a challenge.
It takes days to record the geophysics of the entire area, but the results identify 3 promising target sites to dig. They all show irregularities in the soil that are non-metallic. These irregularities could be the chalk spoil left over from excavating trenches, but they could also be bodies. Target site number 1 has features similar to other Canadian cemeteries made on the Vimy battlefield. Target number 2 is a mine crater similar to the nearby Zivy mine crater that was used as a mass grave during the battle. Target number 3 is a smaller crater between 2 German trenches near where many of the Canadian soldiers were killed.
I'm certain that the men of CA40 are buried in this location. Our problem is we only have 4 days to try to find them. And even with precise trench map references, it's still a large area. They're here. The question is whether we can find them in 4 days.
Time may be limited due to funds, but before work begins, local bomb disposal experts from Cardam Pyro must locate any potential unexploded shells, mark them, and clear them from the field.
This is just a little square. What is it? It's maybe 50 meters by 50 meters.
Yep.
And they've already done 1 strip, and they've got 6 locations where they're going to have to dig for potential shells.
Right.
That's amazingly hot. And this is 100 years later. Millions of shells were fired along here.
Yeah.
So even if 0.01%'s duds,
Right.
you're going to find a lot of shells. This is an aluminum eyelet, and it comes off ground sheets. And this is about the 4th or 5th one I found, and it's right near the elbow in the German line, which is, of course, where we're going to do our first search.
And so what would they have used the ground sheets for?
The ground sheets were often used to bury soldiers. They'd wrap them in the ground sheets and then bury them.
Okay.
And you never find these. This is the only place I've ever found them on the Western Front, and I've found about 5 or 6 of them now.
Okay.
So this is very unusual.
So that combined with what I found here, which I think is a human bone. So probably a leg bone. It would have fit somewhere right in there. I think that tells us we're getting close.
Well, this is definitely a hot location in every way.
The experts from Cardam Pyro detect a large metallic object at some depth. Their concern is that it could be an unexploded shell. Before they can dig tomorrow, they have got to check this one out.
So what they found was a metal spool, an empty metal spool for a telephone or a communications cable from the First World War. And what's amazing to me is how far they had to go down to get it.
Well, when we were looking at these little snapshots before, it looked like everything was going to be pretty shallow. But now, based on that excavation, we might have to go a lot deeper than we originally thought. And that's going to take a lot more time that we might not have.
Well, we've got another windswept day on Vimy Ridge. It's very cold out, but it's really great that we're starting to dig. So yesterday was a lot of preliminary. We staked out a number of positions. Now we're actually starting to dig.
He's starting the first lift now of the first trench, the anomaly. And he's going about 20 to 30 centimeters deep on the first lift. So what Henry's going to be doing is basically observing and seeing what we're seeing there. And then afterwards, we'll be going through the piles of soil to see if we're finding any artifacts.
I'm just going to go right here.
So what we're seeing here is the start of the outline of one of the chalk walls. So this is the eastern wall here. You can see how well defined it is all the way along here. We're still not sure why the chalk is here. Possibilities are that it could be basically a ring of chalk, as they've done for many of these cemeteries, put around a cemetery, or it could have been part of an entrenchment that the Germans did at the time when they held the line here.
When I was just cleaning up this section of wall here, came across this piece of barbed wire. You can see here just the number of barbs on that barbed wire. This is not agricultural. This isn't to keep animals away. This is anti-personnel.
The dimensions of this anomaly make it look like a trench burial. It's a long, thin rectangle. That's very similar with what you find in the other cemeteries close by that were made right after the battle. Burial after the battle takes two forms. One, they could make a trench burial in a clear area or in a small trench. The second was to use one of the existing craters to bury the men.
The bomb disposal experts zero in on danger buried in the clay, and the dig is stopped.
Back up, guys.
Back off. It's the end of a shell.
The clearance team has just asked us to leave the trench. They've gone through with a metal detector and found some unexploded ordnance, and they're just in the process of removing that now.
C'est un obus français qui a encore avec de l'explosif et sa fusée dessus.
Ok.
Donc je l'ai mis en sécurité pour qu'on puisse continuer les travaux.
Ok, d'accord.
C'est bon?
Yeah, c'est bon. The bomb disposal people and the local people who work on these projects have to have certain nerves of steel to handle this stuff. They could go off. And people have been killed in the past because they're unstable. And every day they have to do this. That could be communication wire.
I think it's communication wire, and we've got some insulating. You see how it's got the...
Okay, so this stuff here then, Henry, is probably the wire off of that spool that we found earlier, something like that.
It could be, yes.
This would be that type of wire that would be around there. So I think we're still not sure whether this was just a German fortification or whether this was a cemetery, but I think we'll know that as we continue to go deeper.
So we've just come across some small pieces of bone. Because this part of the line was, was a living space. It's difficult to know when we just picked it out of the ground whether it's animal bone or human bone. But at the same time, we just until we can make that determination, we treat it pretty carefully.
So what's happening with the second phase?
Well, we're starting to get a lot of fairly clean soil coming up. Edge of the chalk is still really clear, but the clay in the middle is quite clean. We haven't seen the types of metal that we found in that upper layer.
Right.
It just seemed to have disappeared altogether.
Is that a good sign or a bad sign?
It's not the greatest sign. So now that we've taken it down a bit further, we're actually saying that the chalk layer has become a trench feature.
You can clearly see the edges of what were probably a trench.
Right.
At some point that looks like it's been filled with the chalk. Probably the results of the Germans tunneling.
So this is the junk that they have. They put it in here, and at some point they would cover it up so that it wouldn't be picked up by the observers, the aircraft.
So what we're seeing actually in the trenches are a couple of these areas potentially where they've covered it up. You see there's a line of mud that comes through here, and a line of mud that comes through here. We were originally thinking that the chalk might be because of the decoration around the cemetery, but given how deep it is, I don't think that would be the case. It's not our cemetery.
It is bad news, but with no time to waste, Norm and the team move on to the second target.
This crater here is our target for day 2. This is the crater that the Germans labeled T5. It's directly in the German front line. It's interesting to us because from the geophysics, what we found is that there's actually a ring of metal that's around this crater. And often for the cemeteries, they would protect it with barbed wire around it.
So we're going down 4 to 6 meters?
Yeah, we think the bottom of this crater is 6 meters at its deepest in the middle.
Right.
And that's based on the geophysics that we did back in January.
Okay.
For the digging team, it's going to be a very big challenge, just because when you go that deep, you have to go much wider for safety reasons, just because of the walls, and you don't want them to cave in. Yeah. See? It's a brick, right? What they found so far are a series of bricks that form a line, just almost like a wall. It's not very deep. It's only 1 brick wide. They've also found barbed wire that's coincident with it. We're not doing the full excavation at this point in time. They're just trying to clear where the metal is. So we'll have a better look at this tomorrow. But the thoughts are that this is either a fortification for the Germans that would have been looking out towards the Canadians, or possibly it's basically lining the crater cemetery.
I think that what we're looking at here, by its dimensions and its location, is a good place for what we're trying to find. It's day 2 of our dig, and of course it's November and we're in northern France. 30% chance of showers, and instead we got a storm and about a 70-kilometer wind. This is going to delay the dig for at least a few hours, and hopefully we won't lose the whole day. You have to wonder what it would have been like on Vimy Ridge 100 years ago for men who are trying not to get blown away in the wind.
The rain will eventually stop, but they won't be able to start digging again. For reasons Norm could never anticipate, his search for Vimy's lost soldiers will be brought to a halt. On day 3, the search for Vimy's lost soldiers was shut down. The local government that had granted historian Norm Christie permission for the dig was overruled by a ministry official from the regional government. They cited an obscure law enacted during the Nazi occupation that stopped farmers from digging in their fields to aid the resistance. Now it was being applied to digging for the graves of Canadian soldiers who died liberating France. With the dig ended, Norm and the team returned to Canada, and Norm has the unenviable task of telling each family.
How you doing?
Good to see you. Well, I'm doing. Still doing.
Cheers. So, Jim, the reason I'm here is that I have a little bit of disappointing news. We started our dig in November, and we selected 4 locations to dig. We started on the second anomaly, which was a crater built into the German front line, which looked like a likely place where they could make the cemetery. And after some exploration there, a French bureaucrat came out and started literally ranting and raving and threatening us with prison.
That's, wow, that's really disappointing.
I'm like you, I'd be amazed that that kind of a roadblock would show up.
I just don't understand from my perspective, well, what's the big deal? These people are missing. Why would you not want them to be unearthed and to give them respect, especially since they did fight in your country? Not, of course, they fought for Canada's freedom too, but they fought directly for France's.
They deserve that dignity of being put with their comrades in a cemetery, one way or the other.
I say we carry on, whatever needs to be done. It's been 100 years, but it's 100 years that we haven't forgotten.
I think them guys shouldn't be pushing up potatoes.
Absolutely.
Although Norm has yet to find the lost soldiers, the families have found a connection to a generation of men who sacrificed their lives in battle.
What I wanted to ask you about, has this brought you closer to your own family's generation?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. So much of this I didn't know much about. Grandma never talked much about it. Yes, I do feel closer to my grandmother, my mother, of course, and my grandfather, who I never knew.
My grandmother is a person who believed in ghosts. We were in one of the cemeteries. It was just starting to rain, and we went out and we read the inscriptions on the different gravestones. You know, I just knew that she was kind of there at every step along the way. And again, it was at that cemetery where it kind of struck home.
What would you put on Forbes's headstone as a personal inscription?
You look at pictures of his parents and sisters, and they're so close. Yeah, something simple. From your family.
Well, I have been working on a small little sculpture.
Wow.
So just to commemorate the story of him with the puppy in his coat.
Oh, that's really beautiful. That's really nice. 16th Canadian Scottish.
Mm-hmm.
This was your inspiration after you came back from France?
Mm-hmm. I always wanted to do something to commemorate him. And the cave sculptures inspired the base there. I was pretty impressed with some of those.
Wow.
The flag is the flag of the 151st Central Alberta Battalion, and that's the unit that my Uncle Thomas joined, and basically that's what he carved.
This is the start to his story and the message he left for us, how we found him, the 151.
From the time I was a little boy, there was this trunk that we weren't allowed to go in. And this stuff of Dad's was in there, his jacket, his cap, his quilt, and this stuff here. And I don't want it just to rot, so they said put it in a museum or something. So that's why Galtz took Dad's stuff there. It was Dad's and Earl's.
This would have been recovered by your father, and the fact you found it amongst his stuff tells you how important it was. Because your father reclaimed this, he will always be remembered.
That was to make tears come.
We have tens of thousands of objects in our collection. A small number of them are something that we would describe as being loaded with respect to meaning. What we have here is Earl Betts's ID tag. His name is stamped in it, as well as his service number. This is something that was physically worn by Earl during his time at Vimy Ridge and at the point of his having been killed. It's been physically altered as a result of whatever trauma his body would have suffered. His brother Clarence was beside him. It was his brother Clarence who retrieved the dog tag. There are not many objects in our military collection that would come anywhere near to the power and significance that this one single object has.
Day 2 of our dig was washed out by an act of God. Day 3 of our dig was washed out by an act of man. But we must remember the search for CA-40 was always symbolic of something bigger. It was a search for a lost generation of Canadians and a focus into their lives, their accomplishments, and their sacrifices. And that matters. They are gone, but they are not forgotten.